All right, welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the story of a literal geopolitical titan, the Soviet Union. We're going to unpack this monumental 74-year timeline of a state that basically rose from the ashes of a fallen empire, achieved terrifying global power, conquered the cosmos, and then just suddenly collapsed. It's a massive, incredibly complex story, but we're going to break it all down step by step. Okay, let's dive right in. Here is our chronological roadmap for navigating this dense history. We'll start with the birth of the Soviet state, then move into Stalinism, industry, and terror. After that, we'll look at World War and global power, slow things down for the era of stagnation, and finally, examine the reforms, Chernobyl, and the ultimate collapse. So, let's start with our first era, the birth of the Soviet state, running from 1917 to 1924. To really grasp how this superpower was born, you kind of have to look at the absolute pressure cooker that shattered the old world. Early 20th century, the Russian Empire is ruled by Tsar Nicholas II, a strict autocracy with extreme social inequality. But things unraveled fast. By 1914, World War I completely exposed the structural weaknesses of the Tsarist regime. We're talking massive casualties, hyperinflation, severe food shortages. And that pressure, it boiled over into the 1917 February Revolution, forcing the Tsar to abdicate. This was followed swiftly by the October Revolution, where the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky, seized control. By 1918, a brutal civil war erupted between the Bolshevik Red Army and the White Army. But out of all this total chaos, the Bolsheviks emerged victorious, and in 1922, the USSR was officially created. Now, what's really fascinating here is the stark contrast between the ideological promise and the harsh reality on the ground. The Bolsheviks originally rallied the peasantry with this brilliantly simple slogan, peace, land, and bread. But the reality of holding on to power during the Civil War meant implementing something called war communism. That meant extreme centralization, forced requisitioning of grain from those exact same peasants, and totally nationalizing industry. So right from the jump, the foundation of the state was built on this intense, unforgiving control. And that control only deepened as we enter our second chapter. Stalinism, Industry, and Terror, spanning 1924 to 1939. In 1924, Lenin died, leaving behind a massive power vacuum. And through some incredibly shrewd bureaucratic maneuvering, Joseph Stalin outplayed his rivals, including Trotsky, and ruthlessly consolidated absolute power. His vision? Rapid modernization. And he executed it in 3 pretty brutal steps. Step 1 was the Gauss Plan, which was a total command economy that dictated where every single resource went. Step 2 channeled all of that into rapid, heavy industrialization, literally turning a farming nation into a powerhouse of coal, steel, and electricity overnight. But Step 3, forced agricultural collectivization, or the kolkhozes system, came with a catastrophic human cost. Independent farms were completely eradicated and jammed into state-run collectives. The grain seizures from this led to devastating famines, most notably the Holodomor in Ukraine, which tragically killed millions. This era was also heavily defined by paranoia and intense repression. It culminated in the Great Terror between 1936 and 1938, where Stalin eliminated anyone he perceived as an enemy, including over half of his own military high command. And central to this entire apparatus of terror was the Gulag system. This was a vast, sprawling network of forced labor camps managed by the secret police. They were often located in freezing, completely unforgiving places like Siberia and Kolyma. Millions of people suffered or died in these camps under lethal conditions, doing things like mining gold and felling timber, just to feed Stalin's massive industrial machine. Emerging from that dark internal struggle, the Soviet Union suddenly faced its greatest external threat. Which brings us to Chapter 3, World War and Global Power, from 1939 to 1979. So, despite signing a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany back in 1939, Stalin was caught completely off guard when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. It was literally the largest land invasion in human history, 872. Just let that number sink in for a second. That is how many days the siege of Leningrad lasted. For nearly 2.5 years, the city was blockaded. Over 1 million civilians died of starvation. Yet the city never surrendered. That number just perfectly captures the sheer, almost unimaginable resilience of the Soviet people during what they call the Great Patriotic War. And then we have this staggering number, over 27 million. That represents the ultimate toll of Soviet military and civilian lives lost to defeat Nazi Germany.
Through these incredibly massive, grinding battles like Stalingrad and Kursk, the Red Army managed to turn the tide, ultimately raising the Soviet flag over Berlin in May 1945. That immense, painful sacrifice is what cemented the USSR's status as a true global superpower, securing them a permanent UN Security Council seat and a tight grip over Eastern Europe.
Post-war, the world quickly split into a bipolar dynamic. The US and its allies on one side, the USSR and the Warsaw Pact on the other. And one of the wildest arenas for this ideological battle? Outer space. The Soviets launch into this rapid-fire string of technological wins. In 1957, Sputnik 1 becomes the first satellite, followed quickly by Laika the dog. By 1961, Yuri Gagarin is the first human in space. 1963 brings us Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space. And in 1965, Alexei Leonov pulls off the first spacewalk. It was this era of what looked like completely unstoppable Soviet momentum.
But all that momentum came with some truly terrifying risks. Running parallel to the space race was a massive nuclear arms race. In 1962, the secret deployment of Soviet nuclear missiles to Cuba literally brought humanity to the absolute brink of atomic warfare. A back-channel compromise eventually diffused it, thank goodness, but that high-stakes nuclear brinkmanship totally defined the era. It demanded this constant, financially draining level of military vigilance.
And that draining focus on the military leads us right into our fourth chapter, the era of stagnation, from 1964 to 1985. Under the leadership of Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet Union entered a period they called zastoy, or stagnation. Now, on the surface, the state projected this aura of immense, untouchable military power. But underneath, a rotting internal system led to this wild paradox. How exactly does a nuclear superpower, a nation that literally put a human in outer space, run out of toilet paper, or fresh meat, or decent shoes? Because that was the bizarre, frustrating reality of everyday Soviet life in the 1970s and 80s. Well, the answer lies in their central planning system. The government controlled every single factory and farm, and they prioritized massive military spending, eating up to 20% of their entire GDP at the complete expense of basic consumer goods. The entire economy was heavily imbalanced. It was built for total war and global dominance, not for, the everyday comfort of the people actually living there. This stagnation hit on multiple fronts. You had widespread bureaucratic corruption going on within the elite nomenclature system, while chronic consumer shortages became a totally normal way of life for everyone else. For a while in the 1970s, a huge Siberian oil boom pumped in enough cash to kind of mask these structural failures, but when global oil prices crashed in the 1980s, that illusion completely shattered. Combine that economic crash with the grueling, deeply demoralizing quagmire of the Soviet-Afghan War that started in 1979, and the system was stretched to its absolute breaking point. And that breaking point arrived in our final chapter, Reforms, Chernobyl, and Collapse, spanning from 1986 to 1991. Seeing the dire state of the empire, a younger leader named Mikhail Gorbachev took power in 1985. He tried to save the system by introducing two massive reforms. First, glasnost, which aimed for transparency and freedom of speech. Second, perestroika, aiming to decentralize the economy. But look at how this actually played out. Perestroika inadvertently made shortages even worse because it confused the rigid command economy without actually replacing it with a functioning free market. Meanwhile, glasnost removed the fear that had glued the empire together for decades, which suddenly allowed long-suppressed ethnic rivalries and anti-Soviet nationalism to just boil over into the public square. And right as these super vulnerable reforms were kicking off, disaster struck. On April 26, 1986, Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded. Now, this wasn't just a catastrophic environmental tragedy. The immediate instinct of the government to cover it up completely destroyed whatever tiny bit of public faith was left in Soviet competence. Chernobyl really became the ultimate tragic metaphor for a deeply flawed, failing bureaucracy. From there, things unraveled in this unstoppable domino effect between 1989 and 1991. Gorbachev essentially refused to use the military to crush dissent in the satellite states, so Poland and Eastern Europe just broke away. The Berlin Wall fell. Inside the USSR, the Baltic states declared their sovereignty. Hardline communists tried to hit the brakes with an August 1991 coup, but massive public resistance shut them down. And finally, the Bellavia Accords were signed, legally dissolving the Union once and for all.
Ultimately, on December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev quietly resigned. And just like that, after 74 years, a history spanning the bloody trenches of World War I, the terror of the gulags, the incredible triumph over Nazi Germany, and pushing humanity into outer space, the Soviet red flag was simply lowered from the Kremlin. The red giant was gone, fracturing into 15 independent republics.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer. But before we go, I want to leave you with this provocative thought to chew on. Was the spectacular collapse of the Soviet Union always inevitable? Was it just baked into the authoritarian flaws of its founding system? Or could it have survived if those final reforms had been handled differently? It's a massive debate that historians are still having to this very day. Thank you so much for joining me as we decoded the epic rise and fall of the Soviet Union. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you in the next one.